He has written numerous books and has given lectures and presentations across the country and globe, both to church groups, youth workers, and academic communities. You can learn more about his many books at andrewroot.org. Also check out his Movie Club podcast at newtimereligion.org, and I'll share those in our communications so you can check that out. At newtimereligion.org, he explores religious and cultural themes in current streaming media. He lives at St. Paul. His wife, Kara, is a Presbyterian minister, and they have 2 kids, Owen and Maisie, and 2 dogs. When Andy's not teaching and writing, he watches a ton of TV and movies, and he is a huge Twins and Gopher hockey fan. I first learned about Andy Root as a member of the Northeast Synod Lay Leader Program, where we've been reading his books, Faith Formation in the Secular Age, and this year, The Congregation in the Secular Age. I've heard him speak several times, and I've always been impressed how he's able to take very complex ideas and make them approachable and relatable by infusing his presentations with examples from modern culture. That's a sign of a great educator. I know you'll enjoy his talk today.
No? There we go, there we go. Okay, perfect. Okay, not perfect, but we're getting there. All right, am I echoing now? There we go. I think, do I need to step back? He'll take care of it. All right, well, when you get an introduction that says you're a Gopher hockey fan in Bulldog country, you know you got an uphill battle. So thanks for that. I'm actually a little more of a Wild fan. Can we agree on that? There we go. Actually, I think the Wild are coming to Duluth like today, right? They're coming to prepare for their season and to practice. So anyhow, I am a hockey fan, and that leads us into this discussion I want us to have, is that TNT now has the rights to broadcast hockey, and one of their commercials says, like, the NHL, it's 60 minutes of 45-second sprints. The NHL, 60 minutes of 45-second sprints. I feel like in some sense that's just life. Doesn't it feel like life just is constant 45-second sprints from one thing to the other? And at least I've had this big question running around my head, which is why do I feel coming out of this pandemic so exhausted? When I was stuck in my basement during the lockdowns, I just wanted out. I just wanted out back into the world. And now that I'm somewhat back in the world, usually have a mask on, but nevertheless back in the world, I feel like my shifts are much shorter, and I cannot go as long as I could have. And I feel like time, I don't know, it feels more jagged or something. So that's what I want us to explore a little bit, is why do we feel so exhausted, or why does it feel like things just keep speeding up? And along those lines, what I think that's so important to talk about is a big question. You can probably barely see that, but could change actually hurt? I know you're in the midst of kind of thinking about your future of your church and thinking about stewardship and things like that, and it doesn't take much of reading about Christianity in America to feel like especially Protestantism really needs to change. And if it doesn't change, it's going to lose further ground. But I do want to ask, well, what are we talking about when we talk about change? And all of us wanted to change out of being in our basements on lockdown and back in the world, and yet at least some of us, I think, come back and just feel like, oh my gosh, how do I keep the pace? So one of the things I want to ask is, could the chasing for change actually cause us problems? And what do we really mean when we think about change? I think one of the big issues we face individually, as well as our church faces, this is probably a dangerous thing to do, but to use a German word, the Germans like this word Zeitkrankheit. Isn't it sexy? Zeitkrankheit. You kind of have to yell it. But these German social theorists will talk about maybe our biggest issue in the late modern world we live in is that we all have a time sickness. There's a kind of sense of a time sickness. And I'm wondering as I lay this out if you feel this and how this affects you as an individual as well as it affects the church. So this time sickness takes three major forms. And so there's three different kind of interconnected realities that I think you'll see in your own life that keep speeding the world up. So we get this time sickness because it just feels like things keep going faster and faster. I mean, even coming out of this pandemic, it feels like things just keep going faster and faster. So there's three elements of that. And the first one touches a little bit about what I talked about in my sermon, but there is this sense, it's hard to avoid it, that technologically it just feels like the world goes faster and faster. You know, Netflix just got Seinfeld. Like the rights to Seinfeld have now gone over to Netflix. And most of the plots of Seinfeld, this great sitcom that some of us who are of the right generation, I don't know, those of us who are raised on Seinfeld love that show so much. But the reality is if you watch it, none of the plots of that show could work in our contemporary moment. Like a lot of the plots of the show are the inability to communicate, and now if they could just send text messages to each other, most of the comic engine of that show wouldn't really work at all. And you sometimes watch these shows and you're amazed at how the technology has continued to speed up and how much more technology there is and how that's changed our lives. It doesn't take much to think about how much technology has sped up our lives, that we really feel that way. And I do, like I said in my sermon, I like technology. It's amazing the gadgets we have, but it's not just the gadgets and how different the gadgets are in our day than, say, Seinfeld's day, but what happens as this technology speeds up is it speeds up three things. And this is Hartmut Rosa who says this. He says, technology acceleration is the intentional speeding up of the goal direction, it's kind of the growth direction of transportation, communication, and production. So transportation, communication, and production keep speeding up and going faster and faster. And the truth of it is when these three things start speeding up, we do as human beings start to get worried. Anxiety starts to become part of it. And there's been a kind of common reality that when things have sped up, us human beings, we start to worry about our brains. I don't know if you remember this, but remember back in like 2000, 2005, remember there were like 60-minute shows on how cell phones were supposed to fry our brains? Do you remember this? That people really thought holding up a cell phone and talking on it, that most of us now here in 2021, moving towards 2022, a lot of us were supposed to be dead with brain tumors. I mean, that was the kind of story from 97 in through like 2005, that we were supposed to all have kind of brain tumors, or there were supposed to be a bunch of brain tumors, that we really worried as the speeding up of communication happened, as even production and commerce started to go onto the internet, but especially as we could talk across our cell phones, that we were all supposed to have brain tumors. Never happened. One of the reasons it never happened is maybe the science wasn't really there, but another reason is that in 2007, a little company called Apple created the smartphone, and now if you watch most young people, they never hold a phone up to their ear. They're texting and then looking at their social media. So maybe that saved us from brain tumors. I don't know. We can thank Facebook. I don't think we should thank Facebook for much, but maybe. But this is actually a rerun. Fried brains actually goes back. That in the 19th century, in the late 19th century, there was a huge fear that our brains would fry as the train came in. That the train led to a real fear of fried brains. There were scientists in the 1880s who were saying that they weren't sure that the human brain could go or could handle going over 25 miles an hour. They thought that you would get concussed going over 25 miles an hour. So people were frightened getting on trains for the first time that could the human brain handle this. Now, I don't know, I'm not a fighter pilot or something, but I think Mach 6 is way faster than 25 miles an hour, but it seems like the human brain holds up, but that's a big fear. And the train did something else which is really quite fascinating, that it wasn't until 1883 that there was the standardization of clocks. So for instance, Minneapolis and Duluth were not on the same exact time until after the 1880s. Why did it matter? It wouldn't matter. If it was 12:20 in Minneapolis and 12:35 in Duluth, who cared? It didn't matter. You could only really go as fast as a horse could take you or whatever, so why would it really matter if those clocks to be synced up? Well, it starts to matter when the telegraph comes, And it also starts to really matter when the train starts going, and you can transverse space at such a time that it really matters that our clocks are actually synchronized. That's crazy to think about. That time really was a local reality. It mattered for you. It was noon when the sun was at the top, at its apex in your community. It didn't matter if an hour and a half, or we would say an hour and a half, that because we're thinking even of time. But if 50, 60 miles away, people were 15, 20 minutes off, that didn't matter. So this speeding up does something to time in a significant way. So one of the things that leads us to think about what it means to be living a good human life, as well as what it means to be in a good congregation, is that availability becomes really significant. How can we speed up and go fast enough and even use technology to have things available to us? And the kind of crazy thing that we never thought would happen to us, but is really endemic, I think, across our culture, is in this speeding up of technology that says all this stuff is available to you. And it is quite remarkable what is available to us with what is even just in our pocket. Like for most of us, well, actually all of us, if you have a smartphone, pretty much every song that's ever been written is available to you now. You may have to pay for the service, but you could stream it right onto your phone right now. Every Mozart song, every Mozart opera in symphony, every Chopin, every Michael Jackson, anything you want is available to you. But here's the kind of crazy thing about it, is all this availability of all of this stuff has led a lot of people to feel quite guilty. People feel a particular burden of guilt. They feel guilt that they're not using this availability enough. So you have access, for instance, to every Tolstoy novel ever written. Fairly cheaply, you can get them. But who actually has the time to read them all? And so you wish you were the kind of person who read that kind of stuff, or even just got through New York Times articles that you are paying $6 a month for access to. But you can read the headlines, but who has time to actually read the articles? So you can start to feel incredibly guilty about this, that you're not using all of this availability that the speeding up of technology gives you, that you can live under that burden. So in my family, we switched over. Just shows you how deeply I am in the pocket of Apple. But we switched over to Apple One, which is like this bundled streaming service. So you get Apple TV Plus, and you get all Apple Music, and you get Apple News, which is like dozens of magazines. And then you get Apple Arcade, which is all their games. And then you get Apple Fitness, where you can use all these digital online workout things. And every month I get an alert on my phone that says they've re-hit my credit card, and it's another $30, and I feel a deep level of anxiety because I'm sure no one is using half the crap that we said we were going to use. So often I sit at the dinner table and was like, okay, who is using Apple Arcade? Is anyone here using it? Come on, one of you kids, are you using it? And then we're always, the fitness thing, like has anyone gotten on Apple Fitness? Is anybody using Apple Fitness? And I feel an incredible amount of guilt that we have access, availability of all of this stuff, and yet we barely even have time to use any of it. But yet we do think those who are doing the best, those who are living the best life in late modernity, are accessing all of this availability. They have availability to all this. The church would be doing far better if it could just reach out through some technology and have more and more relevance available to it. So we know this, the first dimension. We can feel this, how technology speeds up our lives. But there's another dimension to this. And the second one is that we have seen this acceleration just of our social lives. So if it is true that the technology speeds up production, communication, transportation, production, communication, and transportation are inextricable from our social lives. As embodied human beings, we live as we communicate and as we travel and as we work. And so this has had a huge impact on our social lives. It's one of the reasons that when we had the first pandemic come, and really slow down travel and production, all of a sudden another pandemic started to come just down in the Twin Cities, of course, in Minneapolis it started, where there became a huge conversations about racial justice and things like that. These things aren't disconnected. Once you start to slow down or transition those production and travel, all of a sudden other people and other pandemics start to come to the surface. So there has been just a great amount of change when it's come to our social norms that we live with. I mean, some of us feel like, my gosh, the amount of change in just the last 10 years, in some ways really celebrate it, but also just sometimes it makes you feel like you can't touch solid ground, has shifted quite a bit in just the last decade and a half. So think of this as it relates to what we might call a decay rate. So this has had this effect of compressing the present. So it feels like the present becomes shorter and shorter. And it is a weird thing, us late modern people, that we rarely have our kind of concentration where our bodies are. Like where our bodies are is rarely where our mind is. I don't know. I think you all are probably deeply meditative, spiritual people. So you've been sitting here and are just here. You're just here. You're not worried about the groceries that need to be bought before you leave. You haven't been thinking about what's going to happen on Monday. You haven't been checking your phone to make sure that when the groceries are delivered, you're home in time, or what yard work you have. Most of you have just been here. And that's actually, I'm being facetious. Most of us sit in one place and think, we already are down the road of what do I have to do later? How do I get ready for this? Oh my gosh, we got to get this done. So there's this compression of the present. So what these theorists talk about in the decay rate is how long does it take something to be no longer of the present? And the best way to think about this is to think about it when it comes, take a step back and think about it technologically. So for instance, how long does it take for a computer to no longer be of the present? So I've had this experience of being in a coffee shop. You've probably had it too. It's a common experience where you're in a coffee shop. It's pretty crowded. The one I was in was really crowded. It's hard to find a spot. And there's this young woman, this is in a college town, and she had her hands full and grabbed her coffee and was looking for somewhere to sit and kind of saw a seat in the back and was walking, and her computer that was in her hand started to slide, and it slid out and it landed thud on the cement concrete floor. And of course, it was that really embarrassing moment where everyone gasps and then looks. Everyone's chattering and it becomes quiet and looks. And this was her response, which I'll never forget. Her computer fell, boom, and she looked up and she says, "Oh, don't worry, it's just an old computer." And I don't know, it didn't look that old. It was probably 5 years old. But a 5-year-old computer is old. I don't know if any of you got into, this again shows just how much TV I watch and how much of a nerd I am, but I don't know if anyone watched on PBS the Hemingway, Ken Burns Hemingway docuseries. Did anyone watch it? There's some heads nodding. But one of the ways that Ken Burns did it is between transitions, you often got like a slow shot as he was transitioning to another time of Hemingway's typewriter. And so you'd see Hemingway's typewriter. You think about how much longer it takes a typewriter to be old than a computer. Like a typewriter maybe takes it 10, 15 years. I mean, we know where Hemingway's typewriter is. It's down in the Florida Keys. You can go visit it. Someone like Stephen King, how many computers has he written his novels on? He doesn't even know where any of those are. That a computer, its decay rate is much shorter. As a matter of fact, your cell phone, its decay rate is even shorter. A cell phone is old really after 9 months, for sure after 2 years. Like, if your cell phone breaks after 2 years, they won't even fix it if it breaks. So you see this decay rate of how often or how quickly something becomes old. Well, this also happens with our social norms. That the ways we talk, the ways we interact with each other, certain norms we have can become decayed, and all of a sudden they no longer are of the present. So to give you an example of this, a TV example, you know that some of you at least, some of you younger people will know this show. This is The Office. People know The Office with Steve Carell. So this is a very, very popular show, popular at the time, and has become incredibly popular as a streaming show after. And it ended in 2013. And Steve Carell, who played Michael Scott in Comic Gold, he played Michael Scott. For the last about 5 years, so even just 3 or 4 years after the show ended, Michael Scott has been asked, will he reboot The Office? Why not? There's so many more streaming services out there. Will you reboot The Office? And he said no, that he won't do it. Partly he's a big movie star now, so he doesn't really feel like he needs to. But really his justification for why he won't is he said, I don't think Michael Scott's humor is appropriate now. He was starting to say that in 2016. 3 years after the show ended, he felt like the way of joking, the way of talking, that was no longer in bounds. It was no longer of the present. So this show even now it was on Netflix. Netflix had the rights to The Office, and there was some crazy number that it was a big deal that when Peacock came out, which was NBC, who this show was originally shown on NBC, was going to take the rights back. It was going to be a big deal to Netflix because something crazy, I don't have this number exactly right, but something crazy like 30% of all streams across the platform of Netflix were The Office. And what they discovered, it was young adults who would watch this, people in their early 20s to mid-20s who would really put The Office on in the background and do other things, and The Office would just be constantly playing. And one of the most famous is this woman right here, who's named Billie Eilish, who is kind of the pop star of our generation, very talented. But if in her Grammy-winning album, her last one that won all the Grammys, you can hear little clips of The Office in it. She goes from one song to another with these certain clips of The Office, and she would listen, she just, all the time, The Office was streaming in the background. And when they asked her why, she said it helped her deal with her anxiety. It was a kind of way of dealing with her anxiety, and it was a way of dealing with it because listening to this show was nostalgic. It was like living in an old world. Folks, we're talking 2012, man, and it was like an old world that was disconnected, and it felt like it was a way of living in a world where the kind of the rigidity of the moral norms weren't so heavy, and things were simpler. It was a simpler time 4 years ago. And we are kind of living in this where it feels like a lot of our norms have changed. And congregations are in an interesting place because besides other places, there's very few other places in our culture where a congregation often has people with different perspectives and particularly generations. And it's been very hard to pastor over the last 5 years for a lot of pastors as younger generations or the decay rates of what you used to say or what you used to think has changed. And other people just feel like, wait, you're not supposed to say that anymore? You're supposed to say it this way? And it's led to just a lot of anxiety. And it's sometimes led to those who have moved forward being very hard on people who haven't caught up to that. But it sometimes feels like, my gosh, you can be in your early 40s and you feel like, I feel so old. I feel like so old when I talk to people. I didn't know. I don't mean any offense by it, but I didn't know I wasn't supposed to say that, or I didn't realize that I wasn't supposed to do that. And it can lead to tension for people. People can deeply resent it. There's a lot of good things that have happened within it, but it seems to just be going so fast. Some of these changes. So we see this acceleration when it comes to our social lives as well. So it then becomes really about accessibility. How can we be accessible to more and more people? And you're living the best life if you have the most accessibility to the right perspectives and right views. But this leads to the third one, which you all probably know deep into your soul, is that there's just been an acceleration of the pace of our lives. And it's kind of crazy when you think about it, right? Like if we have an acceleration of technology that our gadgets, which almost all of them, particularly that come from Silicon Valley, are supposed to be time-saving devices. Your calendar on your phone, your quick ability to be able to access anyone when you need to access them. These are supposed to save us time. I mean, you have a doorbell now that can give you an alert when anyone comes to it. Like, these are supposed to save you time and connect you, and yet all of us know we don't feel like we have more time, we feel like we have less. And if these social norms have changed, we also feel like we should be free to kind of be whoever we want to be now, and yet people don't feel like they have as much time. So maybe the best example of this for me is think about email. And I don't know how many of you here are deep into email, but a lot of us live under the tyranny of email. But think about email. Email was supposed to be a time-saving reality. So imagine it. This was before my time, but I'm sure some of you can give examples of this, that in the early 90s and the 80s and the 70s, there was part of maybe your job where you had to do correspondence. You had to write correspondence. And let's say you had to do 7, 8 letters a day that you had to write some correspondence. How long would that take you? Well, maybe it would take you an hour and a half, 2 hours. Hour and a half, 2 hours of your day was writing 10 letters back, transcribing them, getting an envelope, getting them out. Well, electronic mail comes along. And now think about it. In electronic mail, if you had 10 correspondence to do, now with email, well, you should be able to do 10 emails in 20 minutes, maybe 30 minutes at max. There you go. You have an hour and a half of your life back. You've all spent the last decade and a half, 2 decades, exercising more, meditating out by Superior, walking your dog on long walks, talking to friends. You've been able to read to your kids every night and prepare meals and eat right. You've been able to do this because you've had an extra hour and a half in your lives for 2 decades. Thank God for email. Of course, it never works that way, right? It never has worked that way because, of course, what happens now is that you don't have to deal with 10 correspondents. You now have to deal with 20, 40, 60, 80 emails a day. Now you have to deal with 60 emails a day, and it's going to take you 3 hours to actually fill it. So what these technologies do is they actually don't give us more time. They give us the ability to have more actions inside our units of time. So now inside of your time of writing correspondence, you don't write 10, you write 30 or 40. And you can barely then do that in 2 hours. So now even in those 2 hours, you feel like you don't have enough time to do it. So our lives keep speeding up because there becomes more actions to do inside of our units of time, and you have to multitask to be able to do this. This becomes a huge spiritual issue, actually, I think. That we have so many actions we can do inside of units of time that, yeah, we very rarely feel like we're in one place. If you're not in church right now thinking about how you're going to get everything done Monday afternoon is going to eat you and spit you out. So you better be kind of thinking about that. And we're all forming ourselves that way, to kind of think that way, to not be able to be in a place, to not even be able to connect with one another. Like if we're accelerated this way, the story I told you about Jesus asking how long, who's got time for that? You know, like, okay, give me a tweet about how you're doing, but we need to move on. I don't have time to actually listen to you with this. So great prophetic word here comes from the Onion. Do people know what the Onion is? So it's like a satirical little, well, it's online now, but like a satirical kind of newspaper kind of thing. And here's one for you. I'm going to have this read to you. It says, "Man on the cusp of having fun suddenly remembers every single one of his responsibilities." Now listen to this. This is funny. It's very funny. But also there's a deep spiritual issue here that is just really true of almost everyone in our culture, particularly people who have some kind of privilege and are kind of middle-class people. This just becomes a spiritual epidemic. So here it is.
According to sources, Platt tried to put his responsibility-laden thoughts out of his mind and loosen up by opening another beer, but suddenly remembered a magazine subscription that needed to be renewed by Friday, a medical bill he thought might now be overdue, and the fact that he needed to do laundry by tonight or he would run out of clean socks and underwear. "Who made this guac?" said the man, who almost left himself to take pleasure in the beautiful evening with his closest friends before he let his brain become consumed with thoughts about how he needs to move on from his current job, but is putting off the work necessary to make the transition. "It's delicious." While the barbecue's host chatted with Platt about how excited he was to see the upcoming Superman movie, sources confirmed that all Platt could think about was the fact that his recently married sister was coming to town next weekend and was supposed to stay with him, which reminded him that he needed to clean his apartment, which reminded him that he needed to buy extra bedding for his sister to sleep on, which reminded him that he needed to make an after-work trip to Bed Bath & Beyond, which reminded him that he would be tired after work and wouldn't want to go to Bed Bath & Beyond, which reminded him that he also needed to go to the grocery store because his sister would think he's irresponsible if she saw his empty refrigerator, which reminded him that he and his sister aren't as close as he'd like, which reminded him that his parents already had a house and 2 cars by the time they were his age, which reminded him that he's been with his girlfriend for over 5 years and that while everything was going fairly well, he felt overwhelmed by the prospect of marriage and the mounting pressure to propose. "Yeah, Man of Steel looks good," said a smiling Platt, who was only thinking about how he graduated from college over 10 years ago and still owed $86,000 in student loans. "Can't wait to see it." Accounts confirmed the man nearly convinced himself that all of his responsibilities would be taken care of in due time and that he should just relax when a friend mentioned a recent road trip he had taken with his wife, which prompted Platt to mull over the fact that he still needed to renegotiate the lease terms of his 2010 Jetta, a task he was delaying until he had a fender bender repaired. In addition, Platt began thinking about the number of open envelopes on his kitchen table, some of the contents of which he remembered were actually important and should be rechecked before he throws them away. "Hey, I have to get going. said the man, who could barely recall anything that anyone at the gathering had said the entire evening. "Just a couple of things I need to get done tonight. This was great, though," he added.
All right, you hear it, right? I mean, it's funny, right? But at another level, it's a spiritual crisis that we can't really be anywhere because we're thinking about all the other things we have to do. The pace of our lives is so intense that the opportunity to just be and to be encountered and to be still enough is not, it's hard to find. And it's really fascinating that most people, the kind of congregations they're looking for, the kind of churches they want to go to, most often they want it to meet their own busyness. So if they are busy people who are always trying to race to the next thing, they tend to want a church that it also appears busy. And yet maybe the church at its core needs to be a place that allows people just to reflect and think and be encountered. And this becomes a huge spiritual crisis. And a lot of these social theorists will say that most people feel alienated from their own lives. They don't feel connected to their own lives. They can't be at a party here and just enjoy the guacamole and conversation because there's just a cacophony of things that have to be done. And one thing reminds you that you have to do another thing and another thing and another thing. And that's a huge spiritual crisis. When we talk about people kind of not being able to hear or recognize a living God in their lives, well, there's just so much stimulation of things you have to do that it becomes obvious that there isn't a God moving in the world than that there might be if we could stop and if we could have a kind of community who could reflect on these things. So just a few more points and then we'll have some conversation. There is this deep sense where we really think busyness is fullness. That for most of us, especially middle-class people, that the busier you are seems to be you're living better. You have more availability, accessibility, and attainability. And it all works really well until it doesn't, until you crash, until you burn out. But we do say this to each other. At least the people I know, when you see someone, hey, how you doing? Almost always the first response is, I'm busy. I'm really busy right now. Which is to say, things are going a little bit out of control. But it also is to say, hey, I'm living well because I'm in demand. I have things going on. And that works, of course, until it doesn't work. So another way to kind of think about this is that can add guilt because you feel like, my gosh, I should be doing more with my time. But there are these kind of, I don't speak mathematics, but there is a way to think about this where there's a kind of equation or an algorithm that gets embedded in us. And it's embedded in every place within our larger cultural context. And Herman Daly, who was in charge of the World Bank, kind of worked on these ideas. And he said, it really appears like in our modern world there is this M plus C equals M primed kind of equation that gets embedded in our consciousness. For instance, money plus commodities equals more money. Like no one invests money, particularly in certain commodities, if it doesn't make more money. So you always have to be growing it. And it's the same with schools. Knowledge plus research equals more knowledge. Just watch any college football or basketball game being broadcast on ESPN or anywhere. That each of those universities gets a commercial spot. And so you'll get like watching the University of Michigan play Ohio State. Each university will get a commercial, and the commercials are really fascinating. You'll hear University of Michigan, a breakthrough around every corner. The University of Ohio State, where tomorrow is happening today. The idea, of course, is the research that's happening at those schools is creating more knowledge. The knowledge that we're discovering through our research is creating more knowledge. The point is to always get more. How could you ever slow down? The only value of a church, the only value of a human life is to be able to grow it, to be able to continue to prime how much you're able to do. That is what it is until you get burnt out and you get run down and run over by that. Most of the churches, as you all think about discerning what it means for this church to be a faithful church, there is a sense in church life where it's M plus M equals M primed. Members plus more programs equals more members. And there is a way of looking at our churches as they kind of come out of COVID and we wonder, are people going to come back? We think, well, what we really need to do is speed up. And we could get more members if we could get more programs. And then we would be able to prime that and then we would be okay. If we could just speed up and just go faster. So my friend is a pastor in Kansas City and he tells a story, this is a true story, about a church in Kansas City. It was already a big church, mega church, and it realized they had a problem. And the problem was they had a big parking lot and people could not get out of this parking lot in less than 20 minutes. And they knew that they would have a problem. They would not be able to prime the M unless people could get out of their parking lot in less than 20 minutes. So they did a capital campaign. Their stewardship drive was to raise $25 million so they could do all the political work they needed to get the city to build another off-ramp that would go right next to their church so people could get out in 20 minutes. Very different way of thinking about what ministry is, but the driving force that makes that seem obvious is you got to keep growing, you got to get more, you got to do more. That's so deeply embedded within us. But what we're seeing with even the onion thing, the little onion story, is it can have almost a corrosive spiritual reality to it. So this is as far as I want to take it, is to just go one more step, is that what it can lead to is a certain kind of malaise, a depression. When you can't keep up, when you can't prime in your own individual life or your church, it can lead to a sense of despondency, a sense of depression. So there's a book, a very famous book that a lot of social theorists quote called The Weariness of the Self by a Parisian author named Alan Ehrenberg, which does not sound very Parisian to me. It doesn't sound very exotic, but he is from Paris. And it's the French title, the direct French title is actually more interesting. And the direct French title is The La Fatigue d'être soi. And if you take the exact translation, it's the fatigue of being yourself. And it's a book about the rise of depression in our late modern society and how depression just becomes really a very present reality. And he wants to make the argument that what depression is it's the inability to keep pace. The need to continue to kind of curate yourself, to continue to kind of do more, that it is this depression of not being able to keep up. That depression is the realization that you have all this availability, attainability, and accessibility before you, but none of the energy to meet it. And I do wonder if one of the things that is affecting Protestant churches, and particularly Lutheran churches, is if we don't have a la fatigue d'être aiguise, that sometimes we're too tired to be church. And that we all want to change. We all know that the church needs to change. But the kind of change that we tend to assume it means to change is to do more with less. Get more. Get more resources, we'll get more people, we'll get more relevance, we'll then get more people, we'll then get us far beyond any worries of decline. And I think my pushback to you all is that we should be worried about that. That actually could end up doing the exact opposite of what we desire, which is to have people feel connected with one another and have them feel connected to God. It can suck the energy right out of you. So I think I'm going to stop right there so we have some Q&A. And we can touch on this. I could tell you one more story, but I think I'll give you a chance to ask questions first. I think we have about 10 minutes.
We're writing the questions down so we can respond up here.
Yeah, I'll do my best to see if I can. Yeah. Paula, do you want to read them, actually? Sure. Yeah, why don't you stand here? Paula, why don't you read them, and then I'll respond.
Okay.
Yeah, go there. That's a great idea.
I'll try to read them. Okay, first question is, Dr. Root, comment on the parents' computers, disrespect, comment on the parents, something disrespect shown towards game officials.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. 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 Yeah, I think that's probably really true that we're less courteous to each other. But who's got time to be courteous? You know, I'm being facetious here with you, but I think that's part of it. And even if you still are saying, well, I mean, just think of it this way: it's like if you're an upper Midwesterner and you go into New York City, one of the things you're the most shocked at is like how rude people are to each other. And sometimes they don't feel like they're being rude to each other. This city is going, and you either get out of the way or you get yelled at to get out of the way, because in some sense we're trying to be nice to you so you don't get run over. But either move or you're going to get run over. So part of it is, and we do have empirical studies that say people eat faster and talk faster than they did 100 years ago. So the way we talk and the way we even walk, I don't know how these sociologists are able to do this, but they have been able to kind of empirically show that people walk faster and talk faster than they did. And so, courtesy becomes a lot harder. Who's got time for that? That's one element. The other element is if you're a parent and you are thinking about priming that, like you're thinking about the growth your kid needs, well, an umpire making bad calls on your 11-year-old daughter's softball, he could be keeping her from a scholarship. So, if you're a good parent, you fight for her to be able to continue to kind of prime her output. And so this isn't about, there's more here than just a game. I think about this with my own kids. Like, this is a brutal thing to confess, but so often when our kids are in a bad spot, it's just like, I don't have time to deal with this. I just don't feel like I have time. So now I can project that towards a coach or a teacher or someone else. That's like, I'm spinning so many plates right now, and then you're going to make it so that my kid is upset because my kid got a C+ instead of a B+. I'm mad at you, teacher, not that my kid didn't have time. So it's really hard, I think, as human beings to not fall into some pretty corrosive practices when we feel stretched. And there should be some compassion for that people who even have that bad behavior, because they just feel like they're keeping all of this stuff spinning and are very resentful now that you're making it more complicated for them. But it's a shared system that we're in. But I think that's really true. That no one has really time to even remember that the umpire is getting paid, $6 an hour, to do this game, and they have a whole other life that they're living. Who's got time to think of that? You just know it's going to be terrible to drive home with your kid and have him crying because he went 0 for 3 and struck out 3 times. But you do think we're 2 were bad calls, so it's easy to get angry at that.
Can we take another question here?
Yes, please.
How do we move from busyness to fullness as a church?
Yeah, so I did kind of leave you in just the bad stuff, right? So the question just becomes, this form of action that just keeps speeding us up actually doesn't get us anywhere at all. And a lot of empirical studies that have been done with people will say, even very successful people will say, the problem with my life is I feel like I'm running faster and faster not to go anywhere. I just have to run faster and faster just to make sure things don't fall apart. But I don't actually feel like I'm going any further. So if that becomes the way the church acts too, like, listen, we're declining, folks. Mainline Christianity is declining. The ELCA is on decline. So we're all going to have to run faster and do more now, basically just to keep the winds of decline from briskly blowing in here. I just don't know how that becomes possible or life-giving in any way. But there are other forms of action that we have that we could value. And there are deep forms of, for instance, resonance, where we feel like we're pulled into a moment, where we're alive, where we actually see each other. That's why when Jesus asks in our text today, how long? It is just a moment of being with this Father in this situation, the time to hear his story, to respond, but to respond deeply having an encounter to him. Or Bonhoeffer with that boy is the ability just to share in his life. So if you don't mind, I think I'll conclude with one story. Is that all right?
We're good.
I think I feel bad, but you see I'm terrible at answering questions because I just talk forever. You learn this in academic circles that you pass dissertation exams if you just keep talking, and you must know something. But let me end with one story that gives us a complete alternative to this. So I met a woman in an interview that I was doing in just interviewing people in their experiences in their church and what experiences made them feel really alive. And this woman was really connected to her church, but her church was feeling like they weren't doing enough, and particularly that they were falling behind in this Pacific Northwest community, and they needed to do more, or they wouldn't exist. So I was interviewing this woman, and her name was Rachel. And I had some really interesting conversations with some other people in her church and some other churches in the area. But she came in and she just seemed really distracted, and like she really didn't want to talk to me. And I think she felt stretched, like she felt too busy to have this conversation. But she was willing to do it because her pastor asked her to, and she was going to give me these 35, 40 minutes, and then she would be done. And it wasn't going well, and I was thinking, oh boy, well, I guess sometimes it doesn't work well. But I had one more question, and I just decided to ask it and see what would happen. And I was doing this thing called life history interviewing, where you write about 5 or 6 questions, and then you just have a conversation. And you record the conversation with people's permission, and then after you transcribe it and you look for themes in it. So I was getting to this question, none of the questions were really worked with her, except I got to the last one, and I just said, Rachel, have you ever had an experience where you felt really ministered to? You felt really, really deeply ministered to? And her whole disposition changed, and she said, yeah, I have. And then she said, I've never told anyone this story. She said, but I have been telling you how busy I am and how I'm a single mom with 2 kids who are elementary age, and I just feel really busy, but I've never told you why I'm a single mom. She said, I'm a single mom because 4.5 years ago, my husband went on a business trip, got on a flight from Seattle, and flew to Chicago. She said he was gone 13 and a half hours, and I got a phone call. And on the other line was this very awkward man from the hotel, and he was saying, he was trying to talk. He said, ma'am, hi, I'm calling because your husband, your husband stayed with us last night, and ma'am, I've never done anything like this before, but ma'am, I need to tell you, the cleaning crew went into his room today, ma'am, and gosh, ma'am, I just don't know how to tell you this, but ma'am, it seems that there's been a terrible accident, and well, ma'am, your husband is dead. And I need to tell you where we have sent his body, where the ambulance took his body, and they said he was deceased, and he's at a hospital morgue. Can I give you the address? She said as soon as she got this word, like the color was sucked out of the room. And she looked on the floor, and there she had a toddler in like a 1st grader, and she thought, oh, my world is over. I'm never going to survive this. She took out a little business card and wrote down the address to the hospital morgue, hung up the phone, and immediately called her mother and then arranged for her mother to stay with her kids, and she booked the flight. She booked the flight, and she was going to fly to Chicago. She knew no one in Chicago. She'd identify the body. She'd make arrangements for the body to be shipped back. She would get back on a plane and fly home. She said she flew to Chicago, and that flight lasted 30 minutes. It lasted 30 years. She said she was drowning in grief. She got to O'Hare, went down to the cab stand, gave the cabbie her card, and he drove her. Drove her to where she's supposed to be. They were prepared for her to arrive. So she got there, and the people at the morgue knew they had an itinerary, knew that she was going to be there. And as soon as she got there, they took her back. She said, when we pulled in, I should have noticed this, that the cabbie didn't drop me out front of a park. But she said, I was drowning in grief. I didn't notice anything. I was just living in a tunnel. She said she got in, and she stood in this room, and she waited. And very quickly, they pulled a gurney, and there it was, a body under a sheet. And she knew as soon as they pulled back this sheet, if there was her husband, her life would be over. And so the man came, and he started to pull back the sheet. And just as they started to pull back, she felt a hand on her shoulder. And an arm came around the front with a water bottle. And she started crying. And she said to me, it was the cabin. It was the cabin. She said, I never felt more ministered to. I got back on that plane, and I knew my life would never be the same. But I knew God would not abandon me. And she said, said to me, I've never told that story. I said, well, you've told your pastor? Never told my pastor. Never told anyone in your congregation? Never told anyone in the congregation. But that is the experience where I was sure that God was moving in my life. And I think the way beyond just do more is how do we create spaces for those kind of confessions? Spaces for those very kind of confessions. She told me I was too busy to ever tell anyone that story. See, my church kept on asking me to volunteer and do this and do that, but not really giving me the space to share that kind of story. That kind of story is a kind of story of resonance. I hear it and I'm blessed. I hear it and I can believe in and through that story, that I see God at work within the world. And that's the kind of story that the church needs. If local congregations don't have those kind of stories, and we think the only way we're going to survive is if we do more with less, come on, let's all pull on the rope harder, well, we're all going to be burnt out. And we are going to be the la fatigue d'etre église. We're going to be too fatigued to be church. But those kind of stories fuse us with meaning and possibility. Even if it's kind of through doubt. Well, maybe it was just a coincidence. Sometimes people do nice things. Or yet something deeper in me yearns to believe that God was moving in that, to proclaim that God was at work within that. Let me pray for us. God, thank you for this congregation. And we trust, God, that you are with them in their own discernment process, that you are leading them to something. But ultimately, God, you are leading them to one another and to you. And we know, God, that when we are near you, that when we are seeking you, we find life. And it's not the kind of life that asks us to do more with less, but it's the kind of life where the yoke is easy and the burden is light, and we can be with one another, be found in you. So give us wisdom. Amen. Thank you all. Paula, do you want to say anything or?